In this video, we're going to go back and do some geometry review, and we're going to focus on special right triangles, and we're going to look at the 45-45-90 triangle, whereas it's also called the isosceles right triangle. So here's our triangle. We know that we have two angles that are both 45 and a 90-degree angle, which tells us that we also have two sides that have to be congruent, because two angles congruent means two sides are congruent. What we're going to do is we're going to label those two sides legs, and then the hypotenuse, we'll call it h. Now, I'm going to take a minute and just derive some formulas that you're going to need to work with special right triangles. And so, using Pythagorean theorem right now, I'd have L squared plus L squared equals h squared. But L squared plus L squared is 2L squared equals h squared. Now, I can solve for h by taking the square root of both sides. Well, if I do that, I can now break up this side into the square root of 2 times the square root of L squared, or the square root of 2 times, and the square root of L squared is L. And I now have my formula for how to get the hypotenuse. To get the hypotenuse, you just take the leg and multiply by the square root of 2. And notice that all I did there was just change the order of those numbers. So if you're given the leg in a 45-45-90, you can multiply it by the square root of 2 and get the hypotenuse. Using that same idea, if I wanted to find the leg, so say I wanted to take this and solve for the leg, I would divide by the square root of 2. So to get the leg, I would take the hypotenuse and divide by the square root of 2. And if you remember, we talked about that you're not allowed to leave radicals on the bottom of a fraction. So at that point, you would want to rationalize the denominator by multiplying top and bottom by square root of 2 and get h square root of 2 over the square root of 2 times the square root of 2, it's the square root of 4, but then that would be h square root of 2 over 2. So we want to just keep in mind our two formulas here that we're going to use. If you have the hypotenuse, or to get the hypotenuse, you want to take the leg times the square root of 2. And if you want the leg, you take the hypotenuse and you divide by the square root of 2. And those two formulas will allow you to find your other sides in your triangle. So now let's just look at a couple examples. So say we have a right triangle, and I tell you that the hypotenuse is, or the leg, is 4. So that's the only side that I know is that the leg is 4. Well, if that leg is 4, and I'm going to put little tick marks here to represent that these are all 45-45-90s. So if this leg is 4, then the other leg has to be 4. And then our formula says that to find the hypotenuse, you take the leg times the square root of 2. So this would just be 4 times the square root of 2. Then you could grab a calculator if you want to and change that over to decimal. I'm fine with you leaving answers as 4 square root of 2. But we can take that and find that 4 square root of 2 I can get my calculator working. Is 5 point, I'm just going around to the nearest 10, so that'd be 5.7. All right, let's look at another one. Well, let's say this time I knew that the leg was 3 square root of 7. Then the other leg is 3 square root of 7. And to get the hypotenuse, we take the leg times the square root of 2. So that'd be 3 square root of 7 times square root of 2, which would be 3 square root of 14. Now 14 doesn't have any numbers that are perfect squares that go into it, so we could leave it as 3 square root of 14, or we could go ahead and multiply that out and get 11.2. All right, last thing, let's look at what if you know the hypotenuse. So let's say that I knew that the hypotenuse was, let's say, 16. Well, when you know the hypotenuse, to get the leg, you divide by the square root of 2. So if I take 16 and divide by square root of 2. Remember, we talked about you can't leave radicals on the bottom, so we're going to multiply by square root of 2 over square root of 2, which is 16 square root of 2 over the square root of 4, but that's 2. But now I can simplify those two numbers because they're not under radicals and get 8 square root of 2. So then my leg would be 8 square root of 2, and both legs would have to be the same amount. One last thing, let's say that the hypotenuse is 4 square root of 3. So to get the leg, you're going to take the hypotenuse and divide by the square root of 2. So that's 4 square root of 3 divided by the square root of 2. But we can't leave that radical on the bottom, so we're going to multiply by square root of 2 over square root of 2. That gives me 4 square root of 6 over the square root of 4, which is 2. So that's going to simplify to 2 square root of 6, because I can simplify 4 over 2 to 2. So this is 2 square root of 6, 2 square root of 6. So when it comes to 45, 45, 90 triangles, all you need to do is remember those two formulas. The hypotenuse is the leg times the square root of 2, and the leg is the hypotenuse divided by the square root of 2.